Thanks, Tamar, as always. I did have an idea today. I said last week I like to begin by having a student review what we did last week. And I was going to ask Tamar to do it, but I'll let her alone today. I did have an idea that maybe someone at the end of the class tonight, will write up in a chat a review. So think about it as we go along if you're taking notes. So I'll do the review myself. There were two pieces to last week's class, and I think last week was probably I hope, the most difficult of the 4 sessions. I met someone in the neighborhood who said it was great, and I met somebody else who said it was above me. So go no. So I'm going to review it now, and it's not complicated in outline. It goes like this. The first thing we studied was that Talmud Torah, studying Torah, is one of the first Mishnahs in the entire Mishnah. And Rabbi Judah the Prince says it goes above all else. The commandment of studying Torah, Talmud Torah, Kineged Kulam. So that's our beginning. And I said it's a bit strange because it's found in the tractate of Pe'ah, which deals entirely with charity. I'll come back to it in a minute. The next piece of that was to compare the Mishnah to its parallel Tosefta. You remember Tosefta is a supplement to the Mishnah, composed about a half a century later, say in 250. There we see the 3 negative things that a person does as opposed to the 3 positive that were in the Mishnah. And the worst of the negative things a person can do is bad talk, lashon hara. And I tried to make a claim that for the rabbis, quintessentially, studying was a speech act. Just like the world was created by God with speech, so too Torah is speech, so much so that in a famous passage of the Jerusalem Talmud, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, would that we had been given 2 mouths at Sinai, one to do Torah and one for other things. He recants that request, but that was what he thought. So Torah is speech. The next part got a little more mystical, and that was a famous passage in Genesis Rabbah, an Aggadic midrash on Breshit, edited in Israel around the 5th century. And there it says that God looked into the Torah and created the world, and it gave a parable of an architect and a king who wants to build, consults with an architect, etc. There I had something new to say, but I won't repeat it now. And all we learned from that second half was when Rabbi Akiva said in the Mishnah Avot that God gave the tool with which God created the world to God's children, the people of Israel, there's a sense that tool, the Torah, can be a powerful creative tool. And then we eventually did see in a later midrash that some people thought if you could really fathom how the Torah was put together, you could do miraculous things with it. So that was more mystical, which leads me to today's session and one brief, broader comment. The session, this is not, we'll get to Julian in a minute, but not yet. The session deals with what we call in English charity, in Hebrew Zedaka. The last Tosefta, last chapter of the Tosefta of Pe'ah, I remind you, the Mishnah in Pe'ah was kicked off by saying, Talmud Torah, studying Torah is above all else. The last chapter of the supplemental Tosefta reads that Gemilut Chesed and Zedaka Shikulim Keneged Kol HaMitzvot, that doing righteous deeds or good deeds and charity outweigh all the other commandments. So what I want to say is the beginning of the tractate in the Mishnah privileges studying Torah. The end of the tractate in the Tosefta privileges doing good deeds and doing charity. I'll come back to those good deeds. And last week we saw there's also a mystical thrust, which people don't talk a lot about. And in general, in the rabbis, it's muted. You see there's mysticism, but it's what Max Kadusha once called normal mysticism. It's been normalized. So what I'm trying to say is there are different tracks in rabbinic thought. And it was open to sort of choose what track you're on. I'll talk more about it next week. So let's begin. Charity. And the subtitle is a capital matter. And you'll see why in a minute. In an oft-quoted letter, the Emperor Julian, you remember the Emperor Julian comes around 360, 361, and he's intent on reversing Constantine's conversion and turning the empire into a Christian empire. He wants to go back to that old-time religion, good polytheism with its sacrifices like it should be. That's why he earned the title by the Christians as Julian the Apostate. But Julian, unfortunately, only lived a couple of years, but he was both a bit of a philosopher and he says the following in a directive to priests, pagan polytheistic priests. He says, I read together with you, I order, says Julian, that 1/5 of this, what I'm granting you, be used for the poor who serve the priests, and the remainder be distributed by us to strangers and beggars. For it is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, that's his name for the Christians, and the impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours also, all men see that our people lack aid from us. Now, Julian had some good things to say about Jews for political reasons, but he didn't like the Christians at all. But here he's begrudgingly says, you have to give them that they take care of the poor and whatever poor were around, whereas we're not as efficient or as good at that. Now, there's been wonderful, well, I'll go on and then I'll come back to the wonderful. Commandments to be charitable, even if we allow for rhetorical hyperbole, meaning Julian's getting carried away here, Julian's praise of Jews and Christians, the impious Galileans, for their care of the needy is impressive. In a footnote here, I add that there are poems by the Latin author Martial in the 1st century who makes fun of Jewish beggars. So either the Jewish aid improved over 2 centuries, or Julian is painting a rosy picture of Jews and Christians. But it's quite clear that charity was writ large in Christianity and from its inception in Judaism. I'll talk a bit about why the pagans, why Rome didn't have a system of charity, and I'll get there in a minute. Commandments to be charitable and engage in acts of loving kindness, gemilut chesed, are prominent in numerous passages in the Torah, the prophets, and the hagiographa, the Ketuvim. The commandments were exemplified and amplified by stories and sayings in the prophets and writings. So, for example, the rabbis saw the message of the book of Ruth was summed up by this saying, the book of Ruth doesn't teach us what is prohibited or permissible, but it teaches us the reward due to those who do deeds of loving kindness. Gemilut chesed. The Midrash reads the poetic phrasing and critical scholars of Proverbs 19:17, and we'll come back to it, that God's mercy, people who have mercy on the poor, have got in their debt. We'll talk more about that later. This emphatic trend was continued in Second Temple literature. In the Second Temple book of Tobit, a beautiful novella, tells the tale of a pious Jew who devoted himself to bringing the dead to proper burial, beyond which Tobit himself says, give alms. That's what one should be doing. The brilliant Ben Sira, another second century wonderful sage, says, a raging fire is extinguished by water. So righteousness, Zedaka, atones sin. Now, there's been a prodigious flow of excellent research on charity over the past 2 decades. Let me begin with Peter Brown. Peter Brown is famous at Princeton now. He's famous for turning late antiquity into a field of study. Before that, the sense was that as Gibbon had written, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, meaning the years of 100 to 500 are just decline. It was Brown who gave the name, or among the ones who gave the name, no longer decline and fall, but there's a new culture being created in late antiquity, and that's the same time as we're talking about in the Mishnah and the Talmud. So Peter Brown wrote a book, Poverty and Leadership in the Late Roman Empire, in 2002. In the Jewish sphere, it was followed by Seth Schwartz at Columbia. Were the Jews a Mediterranean society? Reciprocity and solidarity in ancient Judaism, 2010. My friend Gary Anderson at Notre Dame wrote a book called Charity in 2013. Yael Ben Shalom Wilfan, Poverty, Charity in the Image of the Poor in Rabbinic Texts in the Land of Israel, 2014. Greg Gardner, Wealth, Poverty, and Charity in Jewish Antiquity, 2022. Now, these are major works, and you ask yourself, 4 or 5 major books on charity and poverty. What happened between 2010 and 2022? I don't have an answer for that. I do have an answer, maybe, for why the rabbis spent so much, the sages spent so much time on charity, and we'll begin working it out now. We'll focus on one major collection on charity in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the final chapter of Pe'ah. That's the book we studied, the Mishnah we studied last week. This is the final chapter. It's not talking about what you have to leave on your field, which is Pe'ah, but it's talking about proper charity as we know it. The entire tractate is devoted to detailing the spiritual commandment, the scriptural commandment of leaving the corner of one's field for the poor. I hope to show that this selection of the Jerusalem Talmud from its last chapter that deals more generally with charity has put charity on a new and entirely different basis. Now, it does have a parallel, these sections on charity in the Babylonian Talmud at Bava Batra 8a and b, and I recommend it. Today we're going to talk about the Jerusalem Talmud. And I'm going to read the next section with you. It's long. I'll come back to the last part again at the end so we won't forget it, but let's read it together. Ready for the next slide? That's me. Here we go. Here it is. Got it. Yerushalmi Pe'ah, the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Talmud of Land of Israel, 8:6, and the Mishnah reads as following. Now that's my bad translating. It really says, Ein pochatin. It's in a construction which David Dalby once called the etiquette of proper behavior. Like a dinner tie is worn. This is what people do. It doesn't say do this or don't do this. The Mishnah uses this. This is what we or they, because it's in the present tense, it's hard to know. So I'll just read one of them, but you get the idea. We do not give to the poor person who is passing through, an itinerant poor person, from one place to another, less than a loaf. Now comes some technical terms, that costs a pundion when 4 sa'el cost a selah. So what's interesting about the Mishnah says, a poor person who's just passing through deserves to have what Albeck in his Mishnah says is 2 meals a day. Now, it's quite clear that the Mishnah had to give an exact definition for its time, and then it would be inflation adjusted, I imagine. If one stays overnight, the beggar, we give him necessities for lodging, mefarnesim. Albeck again reads this as beds and pillows. There are other comments. If he stays over the Sabbath, we give him food for 3 meals rather than the regular 2 meals, which were usual in antiquity. That's the Mishnah. So what you see is an attempt to define what the community owes. And one more, he who has food for 2 meals, a person who has enough for 2 meals a day, should not take from the tamchui. A difficult word, but it means a communal platter, the equivalent of our soup kitchen. It was food distributed every day. If, for 14 meals, if the poor person has enough for a week, the poor person should not take from the kupa, the money basket. And finally, the Mishnah says the kupa is collected by 2 people and distributed by 3. So gaba'et tzedakah, the one who collecting tzedakah, have to do it together in 2s, but they have to give it out with 3 people. And we'll have to find out why and see what the Gemara says about that. I hope you're sticking with this. It's not easy. On we go. The halacha, that's what we call the Gemara on the Mishnah. That's how it's divided. The chapters are divided in the Palestinian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud. It doesn't mean the law. It means the section. Just like we in the Babylonian Talmud we say chapter 1, Mishnah 2. In the Jerusalem Talmud we say chapter 1, Mishnah halacha 2 or halacha 3, which is what we have here, halacha. Tamchui, the comment goes, is distributed every day. The kupa, the money, remember, from Erev Shabbat to Erev Shabbat, once a week. Tamchui is distributed to everybody. The kupa is only for local people. Rab Huna said the Tamchui food kitchen is collected by 3 because it is given out on the spot. Now here again, he's raising an issue. If you're giving out charity, it has to be done by 3. And the question is, why? Now we come into appointing people who are going to work in charity. And here it goes. Rabbi Chelbo, in the name of Rabbi Bar Zavta. You see, in Israel of then and Israel of now, they slurred their opening vowels. So his real name was Abba Bar Zavta, but they called him Bar Zavta. We do not set up less than 3 parnasim, communal functionaries. Come and see. So parnasim is evidently derived from the Greek. It's a 4-letter word, and it means the ones who were communal functionaries. We use it to this day. Come and see. Monetary cases are adjudicated by 3. Capital cases, cases of life and death, how much more so? Now he's making a move here, and this is the move I want to focus on this evening. Come and see monetary cases. If you open the Tractate of Sanhedrin, you'll see that the court that deals with monetary cases has 3 people in it. But if it's a capital case, life and death, the minimum is a small Sanhedrin, which had 23 judges. So Rabbi Ba, in the context of charity, says, if general monetary cases need 3, capital cases, how much more so? And he's trying to say that for him, charity is a matter of life and death. And this is the move the Yerushalmi is putting on, we'll see it also in the Midrash, and raises charity to a whole different level. The Talmud then asks Rabbi Yechelbo, if so, let them be 23, like in capital judgments. If you're so sure this is a life and death matter, well, have 23 people deal with giving out charity. And the Talmud answers, if that were the case, until one assembles them, the poor person will be in danger. We know what bureaucracy is. 23 is not going to work. Then there's more laws of Parnasim, which I'm going to skip a bit and get to the more interesting one. So what we have up until now is how often these different charities are distributed and how many people you need to collect and distribute. So if they're setting up a society, a culture of giving with its mechanisms. Now, did this take place? In fact, we have Julian's attestation by the 4th century, yes. I would guess it's much earlier than that, though not everybody agrees with me. It says here, Rabbi Yossi went to Kufra, a place, and wanted to set up Parnasim there. Here you see rabbis, scholars, sages going out to set up a community organization. But they didn't take upon themselves. They weren't prepared to become Parnasim. It's communal work, and it's often not great, and they didn't want to do it. And he tried to convince them to do it. This almost smacks like it's really true. Like this is not a made-up story, but really reflects a condition of that time. And he gives them a drasha. And in drasha, I will summarize it without reading. It says, Ben Bavai, over the okum. There was a wick in the Mishnah Shkalim. And he says, if the person who in the temple simply made wicks, and he's mentioned with all the greats of the temple, you, I'm continuing, who are being appointed over the lives of people, a parnas is being appointed over the lives of people, how much more so? Rabbi Chagai, when he set up Parnasim, he would put the Torah on them, as if to say that every public office is invested by the Torah. Rabbi Lezer, again, we would call him Elazar, unless he was speaking Yiddish, and the same thing, the Aleph falls in Israel of the 1st centuries. Rabbi Lezer was a parnas, was a community official. Once he went home, he said to them, what did you do today? They said to him, a group came, they ate, drank, and prayed for you, because evidently you had helped them. He said to them, there's no good reward for that. Another time he came home and said to them, what did you do? They said to him, another group came, they ate, drank, and cursed you. He said, now that's a good reward. How much you gave to each person would decide, according to them, did you give them enough or not give them enough? And here comes a famous story with Rabbi Akiva. They wanted to appoint Rabbi Akiva Parnas. He said, we will consult at home. Generally, home here means with my wife. They followed him and heard his voice saying, you have to understand that this appointment comes on condition to be cursed, on condition to be insulted. Abibah Bar Zavta said, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan disagreed. Here comes a new thing. So what we understand is, in the reality, to be in charge of charity in antiquity was no great nachas. And you had to prepare yourself for being insulted and the rest. Now comes an interesting debate. Rav and Rabbi Yochanan disagree. One said, we scrutinize, in other words, we're careful, medaktikim, when giving clothing, if a poor person needs clothing. But we don't scrutinize when giving for the lives of the soul, chayei nefesh. If they really are down to nothing, whether it's true or not true, give them. The other said, even when giving clothing, we do not scrutinize. Even if a person needs clothing, give them clothing. So what we have here is, and I would have liked to have emphasized it to each, 3 times so far, giving charity is called chayei nefesh, life, saving lives, appointed over the lives of people. This is not just money. This is people's lives. And we'll see how this is played out in different ways. Okay. We're okay so far? Tamar, we're okay? Okay. So let's go on a little bit more. I know it's not easy to read so much, but let's read a little bit more. So the next Mishnah in Palestinian Talmud, or according to academics, but we're calling it the Jerusalem Talmud, like they did in Antiquity, or the Talmud of the land of Israel. In chapter 8, Halacha 8 reads, someone who has 200 zuz should not take gleanings, forgotten sheaves, payah, and tithes of the poor. If you have a yearly income of 200 zuz, you're above the poverty level, and you don't get the gifts that are given in the field, to poor people. Now, the 200 zuz, most of you probably know from the ketubah. What the ketubah says essentially is when there is a marriage, the bride is promised, if something goes wrong, a year's salary, 200 at the minimum, to get her through either a divorce or whatever else. That's one Mishnah. The Mishnah after it says, 8:9 says, someone who has 50 zuz and buys and sells with them, he's not considered poor, or she's not considered poor. Shouldn't take for poverty. We just said the minimum is 200. But this is someone who has 50, and the 50 are working for that person. They're moving. The Mishnah claims that 50, a quarter of the annual income, if it's moving and buying and selling, that's equivalent to having 200 in the bank. You out there who are better economics than I, you'll have to tell me if this is the case in the Q&A. Now comes a Mishnah which is, we'll see even the Talmud has difficulty with. This is the last Mishnah. Everyone who should not take, but takes, person feigns being poor, will not leave this world until he will be in need of people. This is moral censure. If you take when you shouldn't be taking, you're going to end up having to take. Now comes the part which isn't so simple, I think. But everyone who should take, a poor person, but does not take, will not die of old age until he can provide for others from his own. Parnas. In other words, if I suffer through it and don't take, even though I should be taking, I'm under the poverty level. The Mishnah wants to say all will work out in the end. You will be blessed, as Jeremiah said. Blessed the person who trusts in God. God will be that person's refuge. Now, let me try to sum up this Mishnah, and then I will move on to something else in a minute. Not the stuff in front of us. It goes like this. The final sections of the 8th chapter of Mishnah Peah we have cited here at length begin with the minimum allotment to an itinerant poor person who's just passing through, the poor person who stays overnight, and the poor person who stays over Shabbat. It goes on to delineate two different institutions, the tamchui, the common platter, food, designed to distribute food daily to the poor, and the kupah, the charity basket of money, distributed weekly before Shabbat. The money is collected by a pair of collectors, but was to be distributed by three people. The next Mishnah we just studied defines the poverty level, 200 zuz annually or 50 active zuzim, below which one has a right to benefit from gifts to the poor. Finally, the Mishnah closes by excoriating those who take charity, feigning illness or the like, while praising the poor person who forbears and trusts God for support rather than taking charity. This last point will be called into question by the Talmud. The Talmud glosses these Mishnahs with excerpts from Tosefta and comments by Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud. So the first comment in the Talmud is an excerpt from the Tosefta that defines both the times of distribution of the Tanchumi, of the Tamchui and Kuppah, while supplementing how many people do it. The Amoraic discussion spends the next number of paragraphs discussing the officials who distributed charity. These officials are given the title Parnas in the Amoraic Sugya, though the Sugya suggests that the title existed also in Rabbi Akiva's time. Remember, Amoraim are from the 3rd century on. Tanaim are the 1st and 2nd centuries. Rabbi Akiva is a 2nd century Tana. And he goes home to consult with his wife whether he should take on the job of Parnas. That this really did exist in Rabbi Akiva's time is borne out by the fact that not only does the office and its title appear in Tanaitic literature, such as Tosefta and Sifrei, but epigraphic evidence supports the provenance. A lead weight, deciphered by Ada Yardeni, reads, Shimon, the son of Kosiba, Nisi Yisrael, and his or its Parnas. So we have a weight from Bar Kokhba's time with the title Parnas. There's a lot of discussion about what it means, and you can read it in Stephen Fraud's wonderful book. In our passage, it is clear that Parnas was responsible for collecting and distributing charity. What is unique in our treatment of the Parnasim is a conceptualization of charity within the framework of the matters of life and death. That phrase, Chaye Nefesh, the souls or the life of the soul, keeps repeating itself. The first instance in the first sugya sets the tone for the entire passage, quite seriously placing charity on a new and dramatic plane. We need 3 Parnasim. We should really have 23. This comment has removed charity from the category of financial dealings and placed it squarely in the category of matters of life and death, capital issues. The Talmud goes on to query, half in jest, I think, well then let's have a full quorum of 23. The answer is, of course, that by the time you assemble 23, poor person will be endangered. We will continue with this theme in our sugya, but take a short detour to a midrash from about the same time. Leviticus Rabbah is a midrash on Leviticus, Aggadic midrash, which is each chapter of, it's 30-some chapters, 27, has, 30-some, has a different theme. And it's special in being called a homiletic midrash because each chapter takes a verse from Leviticus, from the triennial reading, and then develops a theme. Here we're going to read together Leviticus Rabbah 34, which has some 60 pages in the critical edition, and penetrating discourse on charity, treating Leviticus 25:35, which reads, if your sibling becomes poor. So they took that first sentence of the Seder, of the little part that they would read in Israel, finishing the Torah reading every 3.5 years instead of every year as we do it, having smaller sections. And the Midrash in Israel is based around these smaller sections. This one deals with charity. And here we go. Leviticus Rabbah 34:2. If your brother becomes impoverished, I called him a sibling, is this not what is written in Proverbs 19 we've mentioned? One who is gracious to a poor lends to the Lord. Chonein dal, malveh Hashem. Malveh Hashem, chonein dal. Malveh Hashem, chonein dal. Rabbi Elazar said it is written in Psalms, God gives bread to all flesh. Notein lechem echol basar. Someone comes and seizes the mitzvah. A mortal comes, v'chotef et ha-mitzvah. He takes God's mitzvah away from God. The Holy One said, it is upon me to repay the reward. That is what is written, and his good deed will be repaid to him. Will be paid to him. Rabbi Tanchuma said in the name of Rabbi Chia bar Rabba, Rabbi Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Yudan, and the sages in the name of Rabbi Shimon. Wow. The Midrash says you always try, and the Talmud already said, you try to cite at least 3 generations of people who said something. And if you can't, you take the last person or the first one, but you're trying to keep the lines of transmission, it was oral transmission, clean. So here you have all these names just to tell you one simple statement, and it is, if it were not written in Scripture, it would be impossible to say it. A very bold opening. As it were, the way of the borrower is to become a slave to the lender. This is what is written, and the borrower is a slave to the lender. So if you've given to a person, to a poor person, you've lent to God, and God, as it were, is in your debt, as it were. Rabbi Pinchas in the name of Rabbi Reuven said, everyone who gives a penny to a poor person, the Holy One, blessed, gives that person pennies. And is it only a penny? Is not a person who gives a penny to a poor person giving that person their soul? This is how it was. Let's say a loaf was worth 10 pennies. A poor person was standing in the market and had only 9. Someone came and gave him a penny. He bought a loaf, ate it, and his soul was satisfied. This is an attempt to rationalize why it's life and death. Even a penny can be life and death. Therefore, Moses, the end of the section, if your brother becomes impoverished, you should support your brother and help him. So this, the Midrash, and there's beautiful, it goes on very at length with some beautiful ideas, and I'm really condensing it to get the main idea, wants to say that a single penny can be a matter of life and death. Reason then dictates that as the charitable has saved a life through charity, the donor's own life will be saved in return. Zedaka tatzil mimavet. Zedaka can prevent death. Moreover, on a theological plane, one who aids the poor is discharged what is essentially God's duty, and therefore God is in that person's debt. We see then that the notion of charity is a matter of life and death in Israel rather than financial magnanimity. And this is a central concept in the sage's outlook. I promise that I go back to it now. Why didn't Rome have this kind of a system? The Roman system was based more on euergetes, doing good. But euergetes meant doing good for the city. So I was a contributor. I built big buildings. I gave grain to the whole city. But I distinguished not between the poor and the wealthy. I gave a huge donation, and it was distributed. Nothing special for the poor. It was called euergetes, doing good. So, going back to our sugya in the Jerusalem Talmud, Rabbi Yossi tries to persuade people in Kufra to accept the position of Parnas. He resorts to an argument based on the same notion that to be involved in charity is a matter of life and death. He reasons that if a person in the Mishnah won renown for dealing with wicks in the temple, how much more will the Parnasim in Kufra gain renown for dealing with the lives of souls, chayei nefashot. This same unusual phrase appears at the end of the sugya, which we'll see in a minute. And we already saw about Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, do you give out clothing freely? You give it out freely, one of them says, because whatever is chayei nefesh, you give food to. It is Rabbi Yossi who makes this report. I have not found this combination of words, chayei nefashot, the lives of souls, or the life of lives, anywhere else in rabbinic literature, save the parallel to our sugya. Now, I've skipped about a full column and a half in the best modern edition of the Jerusalem Talmud that contains wonderful stories and interpretations, all focusing on the importance of charity, while being fully cognizant of the fact, as the Mishnah itself, that sometimes people pretend to be poor and are not. And to this day, when you get phone calls, you don't know what to do, so you try to check and find. Here are two anecdotes, and we'll come to the finale soon. All right, about 7 more minutes. So, let's read together. The story in the Yerushalmi Peah begins Dalma. That's what it says, Dalma. Most critical scholars think it comes from the Greek drama. And that's the way the Yerushalmi introduces stories, Dalma. Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the famous, went to bathe in the public baths of Tiberias. You can go see them to this day, the Demosion, the Demos, the public building where people had baths. Let's say it's a Friday and they're on their way for Shabbos. A poor man met them and said to them, "Acquire merit by me." This is the classic phrase for asking for charity. You acquire merit by me. Zechei me. You're not doing me a favor, you're doing yourself a favor. Zechei me, acquire merit by me. They said to him, we've got an appointment at the bath. When we return. When they returned, they found him dead. They said, since we did not acquire merit during his lifetime, let us care for him in his death. Now, you know, there are two words we talked about, gemilut chesed, doing good deeds, and charity, tzedakah. Tzedakah, the Tosefta says, you do for poor people, you do in someone's life. Gemilut chesed, doing acts of loving kindness, you can do it to the poor and the rich. Going to a wedding, helping a bride, doing a funeral. So here they're saying we didn't do tzedakah, at least let us do gemilut chesed, an act of loving kindness. While they were occupied with burying him, they found a pouch of dinars hanging on him. He was a wealthy person. They said, this is what Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, we have to give thanks to the dishonest among them. Haramayim shebahen. We should be thankful to them. Why? Because if there were no dishonest persons, if one of them was requesting tzedakah, alms from a person, and you did not give it to him, you would be punished immediately. If you turn a blind eye to someone who needs, that should be punished. And the only thing you can hope is maybe this was a faker. But if it wasn't, every time you see a person, you should give something, if only a good word. Well, the next story is a tzedakah story, but I like it because of the turn of phrase, and then I'll try to sum up at the end. Let's read the story just for fun. The teacher of the great Rabbi Oshaya, this Rabbi Oshaya Rabbah, we met him last week, his son was blind. The teacher of the great Rabbi Hoshaya's son was blind. His tutor, Rabbi Hoshaya's son's tutor, was a blind person. And Rabbi Hoshaya the great used to invite the tutor to eat with him every day. One day there were guests, and he didn't invite the tutor to eat with them. And why not? You guess. The story leaves it open, but you'll try to figure it out by the continuation. In the evening, Rabbi Hoshaya went to the tutor and said to him, "Please, sir, don't be angry with me. Since I had guests, I did not want risk to your injuring Adon, the sir's honor. Therefore, I didn't invite you today to eat with me." Now, Rabbi Hoshaya is a great rabbi, as were the two previous ones who seemed to pass up a poor person when they shouldn't have. And here he sort of offends the tutor by not bringing him, but giving an excuse. So the tutor replies to him. He said to him, you have appeased him who is seen, but does not see. That's me, the blind person. May he be appeased by you who sees, but is not seen. Meaning, you've appeased me, who can't see, but am seen. The one who is not seen, but sees, should forgive you. Who's that? Of course, God. Now, it's interesting if what the tutor meant by this, but I leave that to you. You can go in many directions with this. Well, he said to him, he asked him, Rabbi Hoshaya asked him, this bon mot, this great saying, where did you get this from? He said, from Eliezer ben Yaakov. For there came a blind man to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's town. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov sat below him, so that they should say, if he was not a great person, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would not sit below him. Think of the couches, and indeed in Rome, where you sat was how important you were. So Rabbi Eliezer puts the blind person above him in the seating. And therefore, he asked them, what is this? They told him, and they provided for him, with great honor. They gave him a lot of money. He asked them, what is this? They told him, because Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov sat below you, so we gave you great honor. He prayed for Rabbi Eliezer and said, you did a good deed for one who has seen but does not see. He who sees but is not seen may be appeased by you and do good for you. Well, I want to quickly go to one other section and that we skipped. Here it is, because I mentioned it, and then I'll sum up. The second paragraph, Rabbi Acha in the name of Rabbi Hirshman. Thus is the Mishnah to be recited. He says, this is the way you should read the Mishnah, not the way we read it before. Everyone who should take, but doesn't take, the Mishnah was in favor of that. Rabbi Acha says, no, he's a murderer. He spills blood. And it is prohibited to have mercy on him. On his own self, his own soul again. He takes no pity. How will he take pity on others? So here we have a debate between the Mishnah and an Amoral comes and say, you can't read the Mishnah, blind faith, and I'll be okay. You're not having mercy on yourself. All this was a Sefaria translation, which I recommend to you. Now, last line, and I got a couple minutes. We have tried to show that the leitmotif in the Jerusalem Talmud on charity is that charity is a matter of life and death. Now, this notion possibly has its roots already in Proverbs 11:30, and it's a dumbrate that is foreshadowed in the putatively first century Mona Bassi's story in the Tosefta. I didn't have time for it. Mona Bassi's is the king of Adia Bene, modern-day Iraq, and they turned Helene, the queen, and her son, Mona Bassi's, converted to Judaism. And there's the story in the Tosefta says that when it was a time of famine, Mona Bassi's distributed all the stores of grain that he had. His brothers said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm giving, storing up treasure in the world to come and not in this world. Again, saving lives. So there are a few more stories like this, but let it go. And there's also a parallel in Matthew 20, but we're going to skip all that. Matthew 6, sorry. We've tried to show that the leitmotif in Jerusalem Talmud is charity is a matter of life and death. Now, the notion has its roots in Proverbs, maybe 11, and it's foreshadowed in the first century Mona Bassi's story, which appears not only in the Tosefta, but also in the first century historian Josephus. But there is no question that the Jerusalem Talmud has moved charity to a new level of intensity. Was this due to the dire economic and political conditions that plagued the Roman Empire in what is called the 3rd century crisis, with 20 emperors and rampant inflation? Maybe. Rabbi Yochanan, who died in Tiberias in 279, tells us, as it's recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, that he recalled people bloated by hunger in Tiberias, not due to a lack of food, but to poverty. It may very well be that the economic crisis gave charity a greater urgency than before. Both the Yerushalmi Peyah passage and the Leviticus Rabbah chapter 34 on charity reflect a strong feeling that charity is a matter of life and death for the poor. Last line. It is not love, the Latin caritas, charity, or eleemosynary, mercy in Greek, or pity, but it is tzedakah, it's justice, the commandment, In the Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, they call tzedakah sometimes just plain mitzvah. It is the mitzvah, writ large. And according to our sugya in the Jerusalem Talmud, it is a matter of life and death. That's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Hirshman. I actually find it very interesting. So many things you spoke about are relevant today when we see so much charity and volunteering around us. I don't know if people who run volunteer centers consider themselves parnasim, but it seems like they took upon themselves this position. So we have a question regarding who do we have to give charity to? If there are different people who need charity, is there a preference between them?
Wow. Now, Maimonides tries to work this out in his code 1,000 years later. Does the Talmud itself, the Talmud has distinctions of different levels of poverty. And indeed, even the names are the Evion, Dal, Ani. So there are different categories, and it's quite, I should imagine, I can't quote on this, and I should imagine it depends on how dire the need is.
Now, another question regarding who has to give charity. Is it only people who are known to have money, or is this expected of everyone?
The Talmud does say that if a poor person gives a penny, you're supposed to take it from him, from that poor person. So what is different about it is, and one of the reasons why they decided they needed 3 people to collect was that there were rules in the community for when you have to begin to support the community and contribute. And there was also a process, I don't know how it was enforced or whether it was enforced, of taking collateral from people who didn't pay up. And that's one of the reasons they said that you need 3 people to do this kind of thing, to collect from somebody and not just 2. So.
Thank you very much. Do you want to hint at what we'll be discussing next week in the last session?
My pleasure. We're going to talk about how one glorifies God, and this is easily one of my favorite passages, maybe my favorite in Rabbinic literature. It's the Midrash on the song at the sea, a great victory, as it were, song, and we'll see what the rabbis did to this victory song and how many different ways they think one can reach the pinnacle of religiosity. There are different ways to get to God, and they delineate 6 of them in this beautiful section of Midrash. That's next week.
Okay, so just one last question just came up. Is charity gender neutral, or are the sexes treated equally? I guess it could be regarded towards whoever has to give charity and also to who receives charity.
Yeah, let me think for a minute. Yeah, I mean, I would hope so. I'm trying to think of a quote. If you begin with the Bible, it's quite clear. The Torah says, takes yatom ve'almana, right, the widow and the orphan, as front and center, and that continued. I think it seems obvious in terms of giving. We had wealthy people in the prophets, Haishag Dalami Shunem. So I think it is gender neutral. There are differences. I know it's too sensitive to talk about now, but there are differences in terms of captives, in terms of gender. But I really don't want to talk about it. But in terms of charity, I think it's okay. I think it's gender neutral.
So I think we can end with hope for all captives and Besorot Tovot L'Am Yisrael. Thank you very much, Professor Hirshman, and thank you for joining us.
Bye.